and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Allen Unwin. Listeners, I last spoke to my next guest, Maryrose Cuskelly, when her debut novel, The Cane, was published by Allen Unwin back in 2022. The Cane was an atmospheric crime novel set in a fictional sugarcane town in North Queensland in the 1970s. It was a terrific novel that was reminiscent of the dry and other Australian rural and outback noir that became an Australian bestseller and was later shortlisted for a Davitt Award in 2023. Recently, however, Maryrose's second novel, The Campers, was released. And listeners, this novel is just as good, if not better, than The Cane, in my humble opinion. Nail-bitingly tense and atmospheric, The Campers takes us into some uncomfortable territory, a social commentary novel that forces us to examine a society in crisis at a micro level that leaves us questioning what we would do in the same situation. Told through the eyes of a middle-class woman, a wife and mother facing her own personal crises, we witness a community whose fabric is severely challenged by the arrival of some itinerant campers. Another stunning novel from Maryrose that left me unsettled and yet inspired at the same time. And I'm thrilled to be speaking with Maryrose again for the podcast today. Welcome back, Maryrose.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm very happy to be here. And thanks for that fantastic introduction to The Campers. You really nailed it, I think.
So I want to say congratulations on The Campers. It's really getting some terrific reviews, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I've been really happy with the response it's got. It's had kind of reviews in kind of a range of publications and a range of programs. And so, I'm really hoping that obviously that it reaches a broad audience, because the cover does look very crimey, I guess, and it doesn't fit as neatly into the crime genre as The Cane did. When we were discussing it, my publisher, how we were going to place this novel, and we decided on, kind of neighborhood noir, an appellation we were comfortable with, because there's a darkness at the heart of The Campus, even though it's not like doesn't fit neatly into that crime genre.
Neighborhood noir. Now that's a first. I've not heard that one before, but I love it. It is so apt.
Yeah, well, noir does tend to be a bit of a catch-all phrase these days. I was at a networking event about 12 months ago, and I was talking to an author, and she was saying, well, you've just written rural noir. Well, I write surf noir. But I think, there is a bit of a darkness there, and it may not have a femme fatale as noir often does, but you could argue there is an homme fatale in The Campers.
Now, as foreshadowed in my introduction, this book is quite different from The Cane, and you've talked a little bit about that, but this book is contemporary and it's set in suburbia, whereas The Cane was sort of historic rural noir. So I guess I wanted to ask you, Maryrose, were you concerned that this might not be what your readers were expecting from you in a follow-up novel?
I was a little, and I remember talking to my agent about it and just saying, I don't think it's going to be crime. Is that okay? Because my book previous to The Cane was true crime. I said, am I a crime novelist? Do I have to write crime? And she was just saying, look, just write what you want to write. So that's what I did. But, there is, I guess, in terms of marketing the novel, the cover does have like I was saying, it does look a little bit crimey. The font of the cover and that sort of thing is reminiscent of The Cane. So I guess that's a way to try and bring my readers from The Cane to The Campers. So I thought about, I guess, kind of trying to make it more crime, if you like, but in the end, I just had to write what it was getting me to write, if you like.
I completely understand. I guess I was just sort of interested in that process and deciding whether or not you stick to an obviously very successful genre with The Cane, or whether you were more encouraged to simply write the story that you wanted to write.
It is a little bit of a debate that I had, but I was really grateful that my agent had kind of said, no, just look, write whatever it is you want to write. So that's what I did. And I just feel if I'd gone against what I was wanting to write, I don't know that it would have been as satisfying, I guess, or, and perhaps may not have worked either.
So let's talk about you writing what it is that you want to write. What inspired you to write this novel? Was it a person or an event?
It was a number of things. About 15 years ago, in the neighbourhood that I live in, there was some tents appeared, and then, a week or so after the tents appeared in the park, there was some vans turned up with people who were living in the vans. And it was an event that kind of caused a bit of consternation in my neighbourhood. And some of the concerns, were completely legitimate. They were about what toilet are they using? Do any of them have mental health issues that might make them unstable? Is there any drug use going on? Are our kids going to be in danger of, standing on syringes or whatever? And so there was a little bit of upset, but the better angels of our neighbourhood kind of prevailed, and those people they ended up moving on. But I guess it kind of stayed in my head that thing, well, what if they hadn't moved on, or what if the concerns of my little community had reached a point where there was some kind of confrontation or explosion or whatever. And so it just had stayed in the back of my mind. And even before that, actually, years ago, I wrote an article for The Big Issue about the Homeless Persons Legal Clinic, which was a clinic that operated in Melbourne, staffed by lawyers from some of the most prestigious firms in Melbourne. They offered free legal advice and advocacy for people who are homeless. And I met a guy there who was seeking some help from the lawyers, and he just took me through how he found himself where he was. And it was like he just stepped on this downward traveling escalator. He had a job, he had a wife, they had a home. Then he was involved in a workplace accident. He had an acquired brain injury. He couldn't work anymore. He lost his job. Obviously there were strains on the marriage because of those things. They ended in divorce. He lost the house. He couldn't afford another mortgage. He found himself on the street. And it was just kind of like these steps. It just really brought home to me, oh, this is something that so many people are vulnerable to. So that was something that was also in my head as I was writing The Campers. And I suppose I was just interested in that discomfort of, I've got housing security, our household income is stable, and there is a discomfort when you're living kind of comfortably, and there are people who you walk past who have very little, or perhaps nothing at all. And so I was interested in exploring that. And then just, of course, anyone who's been paying any sort of attention knows that we're in a housing crisis. And as I was writing The Campers, that kind of issue, it just became more and more apparent, and the campers just became more and more of the moment. And I started saving articles that that would pop up on news sites about homelessness, or councils reacting to encampments setting up in their neighbourhoods. And I was saving articles several times a week. And it's not just, obviously, I live in Melbourne, down on the Mornington Peninsula, which is a very affluent area. There's, tent encampments down there. And these are people, sometimes people have jobs, but they just can't, they either can't afford the housing, or they can't find the housing near where they're working. In Bendigo and Ballarat, Queensland, it's happening all over the place. So, so it just became more and more, of the moment as I was writing it.
This is something that has preoccupied me and many other writers in recent years, and kind of escaped the attention of Australians, that we are in this housing crisis, and there are many vulnerable people doing it tough all over the country, and rates of homelessness across the country are worsening. But what you've done in this novel, and which I find really fascinating, is taken this issue, which for middle class Australia can be quite an abstract concept in many ways, and put it up front and centre, physically and metaphorically. And you make us as readers consider this situation and wonder what we would do, just as you have in many ways. So with all of that in mind, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
Okay, so our protagonist, or my protagonist, is Leah. And as you said, she's a middle-class woman living with her husband, who's a bit older. They live in a very nice little cul-de-sac. It's very kind of contained. They have 2 young children, and Moses has a son who's about 20 from an earlier marriage. And Leah's kind of at this point in her life where she should be happy. She's got a lovely husband, she's got these beautiful children, nice house, great neighbours. But she's one of these people who's kind of just not fumbled exactly, but just kind of found herself in this place, and she's asking, did I choose did I choose this, or is it just where I've ended up? And one morning she wakes up early and she sees this kind of bizarre parade happening in the park across the street. And these are the campers. And it's a group of homeless people who've set up camp nearby. And I suppose what the novel is really about is what happens when our professed values kind of slam into a perceived threat to our quality of life. People, so that the cul-de-sac is called the Drove, and the residents there refer to themselves as the Drovers. And it's a very kind of community-oriented place to live. You know, they swap vegetables and they have little get-togethers in the street. It's very cozy. They would think of themselves as having progressive values. And so when the campers turn up, the Drovers have to kind of work out, so do we have a responsibility to these people, or should we just be lobbying the council to move them on? How long are they going to stay? And what I hope is that the readers' sympathies kind of go back and forth a little bit. You know, I don't want either of like the Drovers or the campers to be perceived, oh, they're the bad guys. It's kind of, the Drovers do have some legitimate concerns, but at the same time, campers, most of them, you know, have very little other options. Then we have the self-appointed leader of the campus is someone called Sholto. At the beginning, he appears to have other options. Like he doesn't have the typically kind of beaten down air that you might expect of, you know, someone who's homeless. You know, perhaps, you know, he's chosen to be houseless rather than homeless. And he's an intriguing figure. He's very charismatic. And it's not long before Leah and he kind of lock eyes. There's something about his wildness that is very attractive to her.
The campers are an eclectic bunch of characters, some of whom are there because of addiction or simple lack of funds to secure appropriate accommodations. And then, as you say, there is Sholto, this, you know, charismatic leader of the campers. He's kind of hard to gauge. Like his character's kind of hard to gauge, certainly in the beginning, but he kind of pits the Drovers against one another in many ways, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He's a disruptor, I guess, Sholto. And, you know, when I was writing the campers, one of the things that I was thinking about, I had that initial image of this kind of the campers in this kind of parade. And I had remembered a nursery rhyme from my childhood about, you know, hark, hark, the dogs do bark, the beggars are coming to town. And some in rags and some in jags and some in velvet gowns. And so this is the opening image of the novel. But there's also something of the fairy tale in that, for me, you know, there's that fairy tale of Snow White and Rose Red, where, you know, these two sisters living in a cabin in the woods and a bear comes to the door and it's winter and they invite him in and they feed him and give him a warm place to sleep. Anyway, you know, eventually the bear shrugs off its coat and there's a handsome prince sort of inside. And so I guess, you know, for me, is Sholto the bear or is Sholto the prince? Are the Drovers going to offer shelter and comfort, or are they going to turn them? So there's something of that in it for me as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't think about it that way, but yeah. Maryrose, one of the more interesting narrative devices in this novel is the use of this WhatsApp chat that the Drovers employ to keep each other informed of the goings on in their little community, their safety concerns, street parties that they might hold, etc. And this chat kind of goes wild when the campers descend on their little community. It's such an effective way to impart the oscillating views held by the Drovers towards the campers. And I guess I'm interested to understand how you came to the decision to use this as a narrative device.
Well, because I think this kind of forum is really common nowadays. I'm part of it's called Hard Rubbish Heroes, and it's about people who live in the area who've got stuff they want to give away, you know, trying to avoid, you know, waste. I'm a part of a Good Karma Facebook group that's in my neighborhood where, you know, people who need help or advice post. In my neighborhood, there's an email list. I've got friends who live in apartment buildings who have a WhatsApp group. And so it just seemed, I don't know, it just appealed to me because it was a way of showing character easily. And in fact, since the novel's been published, I've had a couple of people send me kind of screenshots of discussions happening in their neighborhoods over various things. Yeah, so I think, you know, it was both something that is a common kind of forum that lots of people are members of, but it was also kind of a little way, like a shorthand way to convey people's opinions, their feelings, their characters. Yeah.
Yeah, you've used it in such an effective way. You really get a handle on the issues and various characters' points of view very, very quickly. From the get go, we see that some of the drovers have fairly immovable views towards the campers and they want swift action to get rid of them, while others, like Leah, for example, and Barb, are a little bit more circumspect. And as you say, there's shifting sympathies, and you kind of don't feel one way or another about either side. But I kind of want to break down the views a little bit more because through Leah's eyes in the group chat, we see that while the campers make the area a bit of an eyesore and they can be a bit noisy, there is an obvious need in the mix too. I mean, does anybody willingly choose this lifestyle?
Look, I think there are some people who don't exactly choose to be homeless or houseless, but they're, whether it's the way they are or the problems they have, it makes living in society very difficult. And sometimes, you do occasionally, and I think also sometimes emergency shelters and things like that, can be very chaotic. I'm sure everybody would prefer their own home and their own safe place. And I think often, yes, housing shelters and things can be very chaotic places. So I think in that circumstances, there would be some people who go, well, actually, I'm safer somewhere else. And then I think someone like Sholto, who kind of seems to be choosing, at least for the moment, to live in this way. When I was thinking about the novel and researching the novel, I was thinking about Irish travellers. Sholto tells various stories about himself, and one of them is that, and he kind of hints that maybe he's descended from Irish travellers, which are a distinct ethnic group in Ireland, and they, traditionally have lived a very kind of nomadic way of living. So I guess perhaps there are people, who do prefer a life that is relatively light in terms of material possessions and in stasis. I guess I don't know. But I think mainly for the campers in my story, they don't want to be living like this, but it's just either circumstances beyond their control, or, as you mentioned, addiction or illness or, bad luck, or just housing shortages find them where they are.
I guess it kind of led me to thinking about NIMBYs and NIMBYism, residents who are opposed in principle to things happening in their backyard, whether that's residential and infrastructure developments as examples or itinerants, setting up camp. Is this something that you were concerned to address in the novel?
Yeah, look, just recently, I forget which suburb it was exactly in Melbourne, but Melbourne's a very, large, sprawling city. And, obviously infrastructure, it's very difficult to keep up infrastructure in terms of, public transport, hospitals, all that sort of thing. So suburbs where, councils or governments are trying to put in more medium density housing, often there is this kind of backlash and, we don't want the characters of our neighbourhoods to change. And yes, so that for me, we do have to accept changes like that, like more apartment buildings, which means that our neighbourhoods will change. And I think there is that factor of NIMBYism is something that's, part of the novel as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who don't know what NIMBYs and NIMBYism means, it's that not in my backyard movement and way of thinking.
Yeah.
Maryrose, what you've done really well is push the envelope in this novel, in that the campers don't just exist at Gideon's paddock, but stir up trouble and provoke the drovers into even more division. But at the heart of this novel is that, and I think you've been at pains to point out, that it wasn't illegal for the campers to be camping there, which causes a bit of a legal conundrum, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, actually, I was really interested to see just the last couple of weeks. So in Redcliffe, which is just on the outskirts of Brisbane, there are homeless people living in a park there, and the local council is threatening to fine them, not for being homeless and living in the park, but by storing their private belongings on public land. And the fine is like $8,000. And, and they say, oh, no, we're not saying that homelessness, being homeless is illegal. We just don't want you. It's clearly immoral. And I know in Florida, they passed a law that made it illegal to sleep outside, not offering any solutions or providing more housing. Yes, so And it does depend, apparently, I think, yeah, on various bylaws, whether or not, camping on public land is legal or not. But yes, but I think councils are finding ways. And actually in Brisbane too, in Musgrove Park, which has, for a very long time, Aboriginal people coming to Brisbane camp at Musgrove Park, but now there's also other people camping there, and the council recently cut off power to, the barbecues and things that were there. And it wasn't just people who were living there who were using it. So organisations who were coming, charitable organisations who were coming in to cook food for people who were homeless there could no longer cook food there. But there was such an uproar about it that the council was forced to reconnect those facilities. So, councils are struggling with how to deal with it. The campus, it doesn't provide any solutions, and it's not a solution. It's not a problem that individuals can solve either. It's much bigger than that. It's government at all levels. But I guess whether it's just in the way as individuals, when we do come up against people who are homeless, how we interact with them, how we view them. Because I think, there is this gap between those of us who have housing security and those of us who don't and who are living on the street. And I was kind of interested in the characters in the campers, the ones who try and kind of reach across that gap, whether it's Miguel, Leah's stepson, or Anders, who's one of the campers, and they're kind, the characters who kind of either don't feel that gap is unbridgeable, or who don't even see the gap, I suppose. The question that the novel inherently asks is, yeah, what would I do in that situation when I see someone on the street? And how do I feel, and what do I think should be done? And yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about Leah now. She's a fascinating, complex, but at times quite frustrating character in many ways. The unrest brought on by the arrival of the campers, I think, mirrors Leah's personal unrest in many ways. And maybe I'm drawing too long a bow, but she's meant to be going back to work after her maternity leave has run out, but she's not motivated to get that happening. She's not sure if she's happy in her marriage, and she's lamenting the loss of her personal and bodily freedom, I think, in many ways. And underneath all of this is this simmering sexual discontent. And when she meets Sholto, something kind of just like jolts in her. So I wondered if you could tell me about your inspiration for Leah and what you wanted to achieve through her character.
Leah, yeah, she's one of these people, like there's a lot kind of going on. She's a bit highly strung in a bit, but she kind of keeps it all tapped down, which is a very kind of exhausting way to live. She's not satisfied with her life, and she's not quite sure why. And she's one of these people, I think, who's a bit of a lurker. She kind of likes to see what everybody's doing. She doesn't really like to reveal a lot of herself. I wanted someone who wasn't firmly in the drovers camp, and she wasn't firmly in the campers camp either. So she was someone who was going to be a little bit on the edge of those two and wasn't quite sure where her loyalties were. She likes the drove. It's very comfortable, but at the same time, she's got a bit of a critical eye on her neighbours. And yeah, so I wanted someone who could go either way, a little bit prickly. Some readers I know, like, they don't find her likable at all. Yeah, and I don't know that she would be a friend of mine in real life either. Yeah, I didn't want her to be someone who was going to immediately go, yes, we should do everything for the campers and we should look after them and get, I think she's kind of protective of herself in her own space, but at the same time, she's searching for something and she doesn't quite know what that is.
I mean, I think you said it a little bit earlier that she's conflicted in many ways. She hovers between convincing herself of this lovely life that she's got, but also has this constant inner monologue that she's not sure how she got there in the first place. And was this ever really what I wanted? And in many ways, she's the epitome of white middle-class privilege. She has everything, and yet somehow is still unsatisfied.
Yeah, it's not enough, or it's not enough of the things that I wanted. And what is it that I want anyway? She's not comfortable with herself. She's kind of in this constant state of, not quite being satisfied or quite even knowing what it is that she wants.
As I said, I was a little bit frustrated by her.
Completely understandable. Completely understandable.
The other thing that I might just touch on is that, and one thing I think maybe a lot of mothers can identify with is that Leah, she shows us that while women are often subsumed by their roles as mothers, there's still a sexual being underneath all of that. Leah still craves something she seems to have lost once she became a mother. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, because the novel is also, I suppose, there's a subplot about motherhood and desire. Mothers and sexual desire, they don't kind of actually go together. But Leah's got this, she's got a young son. She has two children, but it's her son, Harley, who's two, who she adores. Harley is about two. At that age, I feel like, your child's not quite separated from you. Maybe they're in childcare, but they're still kind of part of you, attached. She has Fleur, who I kind of adore. I love Fleur, even though, she doesn't have a big part in the novel, but she's got this kind of fierceness, this little girl who's got a lot of fierceness and loyalty and, love for the world. But that kind of demonstrativeness or something of her daughter makes Leah a little bit uncomfortable. And I think Harley's more like her in that he's a bit more suspicious of the world, and, Leah's his person and everyone else can keep their distance. But at the same time, Leah has, she has this, the sexual relationship she has with Moses, since having children, it's gone a little bit off the boil. It's a little bit hard to kind of make that connection. And I do remember that, when I was, a long time ago now, but when I had two young children, one of them's breastfeeding and the other one's kind of like all over you and pulling at your clothes and, burrowing their hands into your pants or whatever, it's like your bodily autonomy becomes kind of this distant memory. And then, if you have a partner who's interested in sex, it's kind of like, oh, really? Can I just, just leave? Like, can I just leave me alone? And so there's something about that as well that's happening for Leah. But then with the figure of Sholto, who is, he has this glossy beauty, this very masculine beauty that has nothing to do with the children or the domestic realm. It's this kind of feralness, and in contrast to this very kind of safe domestic space that Leah is living in. So there's something about that in Sholto that draws her. And in some ways, this kind of attraction even, makes her in moments, forget that her obligation and her responsibility to her children, really.
So I guess it's really hard to talk about the tense climax of this novel without spoilers, but suffice it to say that there's a showdown of sorts that brings matters to a head. And I'm not sure that things are really satisfactorily resolved for either side, the drovers or the campers. But at several points, I guess, and we did touch on this earlier, it did make me wonder what I would do when faced with such obvious need by people in less fortunate situations than me. Would I invite a homeless person into my home, offer them somewhere to shower or to stay when my young family are in the house? Do I risk my own security to lend a helping hand? Do I risk harmony within my own community and turn a blind eye to an obvious eyesore or a health hazard, etc.? Maryrose, there's really nothing easy in the questions that you pose in this novel.
No, and I'm appalled at some of the things I walk past, and it is hard. Yeah, it is hard to know. Okay, so what are my obligations? What is my responsibility? Is it better to be, giving out my coins to people as I walk past them in the street, or is it better to, decide I'm going to, I don't know, give money to the Smith family or to other charitable organizations that, provide food for people? Like, it's really uncomfortable. And I don't think there's any, I think we all have to come to our own understanding with ourselves or our own decisions. Okay, what am I prepared to do? What can I do? What should I do? And I know that I fall short of all, if I, make those decisions myself, I know I constantly fall short. I should do this. I could do this. I can do this. And what I will do. I've mentioned already, but just, yes, that discomfort. My discomfort is nothing compared to someone who's living on the street if you want to call it discomfort, is nothing compared to that. So in some ways, it's almost a trivial thing, but that discomfort is what the novel's about, and how we navigate that, how we deal with it, what we do in the face of it.
I also kind of felt that we may not have heard the last of Leah. Do you plan on writing another novel with her in it?
Look, not at the moment. The novel doesn't tie everything up neatly. And I know some readers find that frustrating, but I guess I did want a little bit of uncertainty, not because I was thinking about, oh, well, there's a sequel, but there is, Leah, to a certain extent, she's unsure what will happen next. And I kind of like that bit of uncertainty. There are some things, even though it's not underlined, when the novel ends, there are some, there are some things about the drove that I think are understood, that perhaps things won't be as they had been in the past. But I'm hoping that there's a little bit of optimism there, not necessarily for the drove, but for Leah, and also, perhaps for some of the campers as well, that there's a little bit of optimism there for them. At this point, there is no sequel plan, but who knows? Who knows?
Who knows? I said earlier that I don't really read reviews, but there was one that stood out to me, and that was that this book would be ripe for a TV adaptation. And I have to say, I agree. So has there been any overtures to you about a production of this nature?
Not at this point. Not at this point. And I didn't set out to write it with that in mind. But I can see, yes, that it has that kind of potential. I would be very happy if that was if that was to happen. But I think, yeah, it does have that. Someone pointed out to me that The Cane, but also Wedderburn, which was my true crime book, they're all about, and The Campus, they're kind of all about communities where something happens that threatens or disrupts or disturbs that community. And I think that kind of setup does lend itself well to something like a television series, because you've got this defined group, and then you've got how that group is disturbed and the different reactions within that group or that community. So yeah, so as yet, no, but I would be very happy in exploring that eventuality.
Indeed. And so, if there are any TV producers listening to this podcast, Maryrose is contactable via her website or her agent. And of course, if that ends up happening, I would like an invitation to the red carpet premiere of such an event.
I'll see what I can do, Claudine.
Now, Maryrose, there was a decent break between The Cane and The Campus. Was that a deliberate decision or just circumstance?
No, I'm not a fast writer, and once I'd submitted, and actually I did find The Campus a bit of a struggle at various times, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I think because with both someone who knows me very well said when she read The Campus that, unlike my other two books, she couldn't hear my voice in her head kind of narrating it to her. So I think because it is a bit of departure from The Cane, and so I think I did kind of struggle a bit with finding the right voice for it, and it just took a bit of time to work itself out. Yeah, so hopefully it won't be the next one. I have started writing something else, so hopefully it won't be 3 years before that one sees the light of day.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think the last time we chatted, I asked you about tips for other writers out there. And while I'd welcome some more, I thought perhaps this time you might want to offer some insight about what you've learned about yourself as a writer in the time since the publication of The Cane.
In terms of writing, I suppose, actually, in between writing The Cane and writing The Campus, I read Charlotte Wood's book, The Luminous Solution. And because often, I kind of sit down in front of the computer or whatever, and I'm just like, oh, do I have to do this? Kind of a bit of a struggle. And Charlotte Wood talks about this quality of curious optimism. So when you sit down, it's kind of like, okay, what is going to happen today? What am I going to write today? What's going to be revealed to me today? And so I try and bring that now to my writing, that sense of not having this bar I have to jump over, but just like, okay, what is going to come up today? And so I guess that's what I'm trying to grab onto when I'm writing now, that sense of curious optimism.
I love that. I must look that book up. I mean, that sounds like something we could all do with, something to harness instead of, feeling like it's a big hill to climb to sit here and write 500 words or 1,000 words or whatever the case may
That's
be.
this is problem I have to solve, or is this kind of like, oh, yeah. So I find that useful. It just makes me feel a bit more open and a bit more relaxed about it.
Well, Maryrose, it's been wonderful to chat with you again about this topical and gripping novel. I wish you all the best with it. And thank you so much for joining me again on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been a complete pleasure, Claudine. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.